Well, good morning and welcome to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at UC San Diego. To our members in person, we have a great crowd today. To those watching on Zoom and those that will watch at a later date on video. My name is Dave Guggenheim. I'm the chair of your advisory council. Today's talk will be the quest for human origins. And I'm not going to tell you what our friend Pascal is going to talk about. But I will tell you a little bit about Pascal. Pascal is an evolutionary biologist. He is the executive co-director of CARTA. Many of you already know what CARTA is, but if you don't, it's the Center for Academic Research and Training in Anthropogeny. Anthropogeny being the origins of humans. So Pascal is a professor and chair of anthropology and professor of pathology at UC San Diego. He's interested in the evolutionary mechanisms responsible for generating and maintaining primate molecular diversity. He has studied the behavioral ecology of wild chimpanzees in the Ivory Coast and population genetics in West African chimpanzees. He received his MS in population biology and his PhD in zoology from Basel University in Switzerland. Pascal, it's my pleasure to welcome you back to Osher.
Thank you very much, David. Can you all hear me? Can you all hear my Swiss English accent after 31 years? I moved here too late. It's one of the amazing things about human language. You can only learn it without an accent before you go through puberty. So I have good news for you. The topic of my talk is the quest for human origins. And I will start my talk by acknowledging that humans were created 6,000 years ago by this mother goddess. And this is the end of my talk. Now we know where humans come from. No, it's April 1st, so I had to pull your leg a little bit. Now let me. So here's our mother goddess. Incidentally, this is the oldest ceramic in the world. It's about 30,000 years old. It's a replica I made from clay in PB. And it's one of these Venuses from the Upper Stone Age. We don't know who made them or why, but they were obviously impressed by fertile women who probably back then were still in charge. She also made the big mistake of then creating men. That was just a joke. So back to the lecture. I'm going to try to give you a very quick overview of over 6 million years of prehistory. And I will start out by reminding you, if I can remove the OK. Oh, the next challenge. So our species, Homo sapiens, has been around for about 300,000 years. Everything you have learned in school about history and even prehistory mostly has to do with the last 12,000 years, which is when farming originated. It turns out that we were mostly shaped, like all living organisms, we are shaped by our environment via natural selection. In humans' case, also cultural selection. So we started shaping ourselves. But much of that shaping happened in deep time, long before there was any writing, which only is about 5,000 years old. And we now can use our brains to read. So these are two skulls held by my colleague, Berhan Asfa, who is a Berkeley-trained paleontologist in Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia. One of them was found by him, Herto man, 160,000 years old on the left. The other one is Jebel Irud. It's a cast of the Moroccan skull found in Morocco, 300,000 years old, and pretty much a modern human. What gave us brains that are ready to read? Because we all read now. Mind you, reading was reserved to like a single-digit percentage of mostly males for the last few thousand years until this century or last century. So the entire story I'll tell you will be based on this capacity that the human brain has to read. And I will start with this, and I have shown this slide here before. These are a couple of tracks, human and animal track. This is a human track. These are two zebra tracks. There is some more human tracks with a sandal and some cows. The human brain can read signs in the dirt of a human who was there barefoot, identified by my colleague pointing his arrow to it. These are Hadza foragers, hunter-gatherers in Tanzania that live today, and they can read the entire scene. He was telling me, oh, that's this guy, Philemon, who it looks like he hunted a zebra. And sure enough, he had hunted a zebra. And the sandal print, that's from a Datoga pastoralist who came by with a couple of cows later. It turns out we are the only species capable of doing that. This evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, ever since we started using bows and arrows and arrow poison. Why can no other species do that? We have some very big-brained fellow species. Think of the orcas or the dolphins or the elephants. There is no evidence of any other species capable of reading footprints or handprints. So great apes do not get their own tracks. Of course, reading tracks is really important for something else. This is a scene from Tanzania, and I will let you. We've just discovered this snare. There is a bent tree that gives you the force, and Shadrach here is going to demonstrate what happens if you step on the trap. This is strong enough to capture a big ungulate that will then be hanging there until the hunter comes by. This is a hunting machine. But hunting machines like that only work if you're capable of reading the tracks and then capable of making a complex tools that only involves wood and fiber that will never be found in the archeological record, unlike stone tools. So it turns out I'm going to jump to the other extreme of what we now read. You all remember COVID, probably not too fondly. This is the spike glycoprotein of the COVID virus. And what you see in pink is the footprints of your immune response, of the population immune response to the circulating COVID strain. So we're now capable to use that same reading and look for tracks of immune selection on a virus, but in the very same way that our ancestors were able to find a track so that they could decide to put their snare there to capture their meal. And we can actually reconstitute these glycoproteins, and this is extremely important because this is what vaccines are based on, and vaccines are the most successful medical intervention ever produced. So when you talk about the quest for human origins, you have to be aware of the fact that you have to look at societies which exist in villages and landscape at the scale of kilometers. Our own bodies are 1,000 times smaller. We're between 1 and 2 meters, depending on how tall we are. If you go 1,000 times smaller, you're talking about millimeters. That's the thickness of your neocortex in your brain, or the thickness of an epithelium on your lungs. 1,000 times smaller is a micrometer. That's the size of a bacterium, like the microbiome on your skin and in your gut. And 1,000 times smaller, now you're at a nanometer, the scale of a molecule. And 10 times smaller, you're the size of an angstrom or an atom. So when you think about our origin, there are questions you can ask that range from kilometers to meters to millimeters to micrometers to nanometers. And it's really important to kind of try to travel back and forth between these layers of investigation. What humans do so well is not just using tools. You see a chimpanzee there cracking a very hard nut with a big rock. We know from actually archaeology done on these stone tools that chimpanzees in that part of West Africa have been doing so for thousands of years. When the stone breaks, they look for a new stone. They don't realize that actually the broken stone, that's the really, really precious stuff. I have some pieces of broken stone here that I'll pass around in just a moment. So what we do so well is not only do we use tools, but we learn from others. We can share our brains through language, through instruction. And so we build upon ideas. We realize, oh, a stone can break. That can change the shape of the tool. And then we realize, oh, wait, what breaks off is actually the really precious thing, because we can haft it and make an arrow or a spear. We have learned to manipulate dirt into new stone, the Neolithic or pottery. We can melt sand into glass, and this allows us to make, photovoltaic cells or semiconductors. So humans have evolved not just simple tool use, but a ratcheting culture, which allows humans to take ideas of others. In a group such as this, there's probably 2 people who have a really good idea today. But all of us are really good at imitating a good idea. And without these two things, you do not get ratcheting culture. You need innovation and you need imitation and enthusiasm for something that is worth imitating. And that's how you end up with human cumulative culture. And what this does, it makes us a highly unusual species. We have two different forms of inheritance. Like all life, we inherit genetic information in the form of nucleic acid, DNA, passed on from generation to generation. But we have a second inheritance system that is the hallmark of our species, and that is cultural transmission, where ideas are transmitted, sometimes silly ideas, but they are transmitted, and they can be very, very conservative. They die out very slowly sometimes, and that's a problem with bad ideas. Once they're part of the culture, they're there. So what we do, and I cannot prove to you that other animals don't do that. I know these days you watch Nova or Discovery Channel, and it sounds like when you're not watching, the monkeys are having philosophical discussions behind your back. A lot of that is hype. It's very well-intended hype, because we've had hundreds of years where we put down other animals and humans are the best and we're the cream of creation. That's hubris and arrogance. But the pendulum of correction, like often, has swung too far, where people say, no, of course chimpanzees talk. Well, chimpanzees don't use symbols. We can teach them to use symbols with grad students that spend thousands of hours with operant conditioning and peanuts and things, and then they get symbols, but they never use them in the wild. They don't have personal names. They don't have, not having names, they cannot refer to other individuals in neighboring groups. Humans make groups of groups. We form kinship networks, and that's how we can create tribes. We have shared rituals, dance, and music that are beginnings of that in many animals, but in humans, these things are deployed to celebrate our identities. Very often also to celebrate the fact that our identities happen to be better than the identities of the neighbor. There are hundreds of human groups whose name for their tribe is humans. What does that tell you about what they think about their neighbors? We have sacred spaces. We walk around as billboards. We can look at each other and see what kind of clothing you wear, how formal are you, do you have a Harvard t-shirt on, and so forth. And the way we modify our bodies, our hair, unlike all other non-human primates, we have permanently growing head hair. Those of us with a Y chromosome tend to lose them a little bit, then we do funny things with our facial hair, also absent in the apes. Hair are a biological feature that seems to have evolved to facilitate cultural expression of identity. All traditional human groups do really interesting things with their hair. So that's potentially a nice example of how biology and culture start playing together. And then, somewhat sadly and shockingly, human cooperation humans are out of the box cooperative. Little kids enjoy helping other little kids, much more so than chimpanzees. This has actually been tested with captive chimpanzees. But we do so best when we compete with other groups. So this is the big irony of our pro-sociality, that very often when we perceive a threat from outside, from another group, when we compete with other groups, that's when we cooperate the best within our own group. And you would ask yourself, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could generate that type of self-sacrifice and patriotism at a global level? Maybe that's what we would need, but you probably can't do it without an external threat. I know conservationists have tried to paint the conservation crisis as this external threat, but it doesn't seem to be working too well in terms of global gelling and everybody cooperating. So here we are. We used to be a bipedal ape without permanent hair that walked out of Africa through savannas and deserts and colonized the entire planet. This is from the New York Times. It's a wonderful illustration. You can see the total human biomass of 8 billion people in that little red box in the middle. To the left are the other life forms, bacteria, plants, fungi, many more than. And look at all the other animals. It's just a box slightly bigger than us, 8 billion. And then to the right is all the stuff we have made, right? It includes bricks, plastics, aggregates, concrete, metals, and asphalt. So we are everywhere. There's 8 billion of us. We caused the 6th mass extinction, and we have generated a huge huge amount of stuff, some of it not visible from space. Now, how did we get here? It turns out that if you look from space, and this is from one of the satellite looking at the Rift Valley of Africa, you can see the Red Sea, and there are cracks in the African continent, the Eastern Rift, the Western Rift, and the Afar Rift. Because the continent is cracking apart there, and there is long stretches of dry season and then heavy rains, slowly, the rains every year are revealing new fossils that have piled up in layers and layers of dirt. And after every rain, paleontologists rush out there and hope to find new fossils. So most fossils actually come from this region, the Rift region of Africa. And that's dangerous because it's a bit like the drunk guy looking for his key under the lamppost. We know that bipedal hominins have existed all over Africa. But the take-home message, first take-home message is, any fossils older than 2 million years, you only find in Africa. Now, that's one of the really strong pieces of evidence that we're all African. Some of us more recently in exile. So I'm going to show this again and again. It shows you a stylized map of just Africa and Eurasia. And it shows you where the oldest fossils have been found. One of the oldest clearly bipedal, at least facultatively bipedal fossil in blue there is Sahelanthropus chadensis, named after the country of Chad. And this is, there's a single skull. It was very badly crushed, but the good news is these days with computer methods, you can actually piece together even a badly crushed skull and reshape it and even generate a view of the brain on the inside, where the brain used to sit. And this tells us clearly this was an upright ape because the entrance to the skull was at the bottom, not at the back, like in chimps. But the only post-cranial skeleton is a few leg bones and arm bones. And we don't really know if it's the same species. They were found right next by. So that's a huge problem. It's one skull and a couple of bones, and then we have nothing for another 1.5 million years. So that tells you how biased this field must be, because most of the information is not there. But this is so much better than what Darwin and Huxley had, and they guessed correctly that we had African ancestry and that the African apes that are alive today are close relatives. We jump for 1.5 million years and get to another genus known as Ardipithecus, or Ardi, and there the information gets much better. Why? Because it's almost half a skeleton. You can mirror the skeleton, so you can reconstruct the legs, the pelvis, the knees. And this was clearly a bipedal ape, an upright ape. We don't know whether it still had fur, but the reconstruction here shows it with fur. It shows you where it was found in the Afar Rift, this very deep depression of the country splitting apart. You can see the skull there, and then an attempted reconstruction of how this being must have looked. We know that she was likely a female. There's a lot of teeth found, and interestingly, there was almost no sexual dimorphism. The only primates that have same-size canine, named after dogs, with pointy teeth, are monogamous. So the paleontologists make a big story out of this. Oh, if there's all the canine look the same size, that means there probably was not a big difference between males and females. Could this be the beginning of pair bonding? You know, a lot of pulling at straws, right? But that's how limited paleontological data are. So I was very, very fortunate to, this is my colleague Berhan Asfar again in Addis Ababa, and a couple of students from UCSD. And we're looking at the actual fossil, which is like, gives me goosebumps, right? So this is, you can see the safes in the back. This is very, very heavily secured in Addis Ababa. And people like, presidents of different countries can see this, and our UCSD students. What we do have is plenty of information about the environment in which this bipedal ape lived. Why? Because it didn't fall into a cave. It was found in a beautifully sandwiched layer between different volcanic flows, so it allows us to date it quite safely. And it's full of animals and full of plants. This was the landscape in which it lived. This landscape is today in Tanzania, but Ethiopia 4.3 million years ago looked like this. Interestingly, in this landscape today, you have chimpanzees that live in an area that is very similar to where one of our ancestors or close relative of our ancestors used to live. This is the information on the wildlife. To the left, you see what was found with Ardi. You can use this facility to read patterns and use stable isotopes to reconstruct what type of plants this being was eating 4.3 million years ago. And the answer is it lived in a landscape like to the left, not in a savanna with hippos and impalas and horses and pigs, but with these bush antelopes and duikers and even monkeys. So that's an incredible, something that paleontologists have been dreaming about. Do you have the intermediate form between an ape and a human? Well, this is very, very much an intermediate form. Is she our direct ancestors? We have no proof for that. But the agreement is she's probably, if she's not our direct ancestor, she's pretty close to our direct ancestor. Clearly a bipedal ape still spending a lot of time in trees and possibly eating things that look much more still like a forested or savanna. We now move to a group of extinct hominins that almost certainly include our ancestors. They're called Australopithecines, which is Greek australo for south and pithecus for monkey, so southern monkeys, and that they include Lucy. They were bipedal, they were not very tall, the brains were a little bit bigger than chimpanzees, but the hands started looking modern. So this is Australopithecus anamensis, only existed as the fossils you see to the right, a piece of mandible and a couple of postcranial. And then my colleague, Johannes Haile Selassie, who's now the president or the director of the Institute for Human Origins at ASU in Tempe. He's from Ethiopia, Berkeley trained, found a skull. So we now have a skull for Australopithecus anamensis, which was, bipedal most of the time. The toes now are in line. Ardipithecus had a toe that was not in line. These guys had a toe that was in line. They made footprints that were found. This is the very famous Lucy, that the 50 years of her discovery was celebrated last year, found by Johansson's and colleague. And somebody even made a marble statue of her wrapped in a shroud. She was found in a similar region. This species had a massive sexual dimorphism. Look at the two skulls between male and female. Much, much bigger males than females. We don't quite know what this means. But importantly, they had modern hands. We even have a young Australopithecus that's not quite 3 years old and that died 3.5 million years ago, where we have the skull, which tells us about how rapidly or slowly they grew. They still grew quite rapidly. And we have a reconstruction there, and it shows you some of the postcranial, very importantly, the knee tells you it's absolutely a biped with modern hands. This is Zerai Alemseged, who was trained in France, and he found Selam, or Lucy's child, and is using a 3D printed scan there to explain features of the skull to some of my students that were lucky enough to come to Addis Ababa a couple of years ago. This fossil includes a hyoid bone, which is rather remarkable, that indicates these creatures still had air sacs like chimpanzees or gibbons used to sing. Air sacs go away once we had a modern larynx that is very important for speech production.
Tu veux changer là?
I'm quickly showing you this video of an ape here, very much alive. That is my brother's clock. And you can see how small the thumb is. That's one of the differences that change.
So c'est un petit peu plus, on a plus de temps ensemble.
So much for no precision grip.
Watch how she uses two indices to pull out the pin.
Tu le tires. Elle veut changer la date maintenant, voilà.
She also changes the date. So the big difference that happened to these modern hands is the thumb got much, much stronger. And I'll pass these few flint pieces around. Don't cut yourself. If you hold a flint piece like that, you can skin an entire animal. And it's exactly what apes cannot do. They cannot exert this huge power that is powered by muscles here in your lower arm. And that allows you to slice and make rawhide, or clean the inside of skin to make clothing, or make a point of wood sharp and so on. So this is flint, which is a sedimentary rock. This is an example of a hippo mandible that is almost 200,000 years old, and I'm using my pinky there to indicate where the cut mark is. So this was defleshed by Australopithecines, or likely Homo erectus in Ethiopia, This is Johannes Bayene, who is an archaeologist in Ethiopia. These Australopithecines seem to have given rise to the vegetarian experiments of human origins. They're called the robust Australopithecines. They have huge teeth. They probably used some tools as well. There's no evidence that they ate a lot of meat, whereas Australopithecines might have started to become carnivorous. They did well. They lived from Ethiopia all the way down to South Africa, but then they went extinct. They exist for about a million years. And there's a lot of questions of how big these beings were based on their footprints. These are the famous Laetoli footprints and fossils. We can tell that most of these bipedal apes were around 1 meter tall, not really tall. Size suddenly increased with the genus Homo around 2 million years ago. Last year in Kenya, there's a brand new finding of in a layer of volcanic ash after a rain that turned into mud. Side by side are two different footprints, one made by Homo erectus, a tall ancestor of ours, and the other one made by a coexisting Paranthropus, or a robust Australopithecus, in the same bed. I mean, it's incredibly lucky, just published last year, 1.2 million years old. So these guys were still around, these other Australopithecines that concentrating on eating really hard plant food and then went extinct, were in the same landscape as our ancestors, which is an amazing thing to think about. In blue here is the genus Homo that eventually gave rise to us. So you can see it's really complicated. There are no lines between any of these things because we're not sure who is whose ancestor. We just know somebody found the fossils, described them really well, but the story is still to be told. But to simplify, you can say we did get up first. We kept a really small brain. Then we modernized the hands, and then interesting things happened to our brain. And the blue is where the body got bigger and the brain started getting bigger and became ready to read things, possibly tracks and other things. The average survival time of one of these species is about 1 million years, which fits with what zoologists see for big mammals. Usually a species around for 1 million years and then it either dies out or evolves into something else. We've only been around for 1/3 that long, right? So it's yet to be seen if we make it to 1 million years. We're working very hard at not making it. What we did do is, it looks like we terminated 50,000 years ago. There were 5 to 6 different species of humans on planet Earth. Wherever we, modern Homo sapiens, showed up, and there was somebody else, there was some interbreeding, which we'll talk in a moment about, but mostly they all disappeared. Unfortunately, that doesn't bode very well for other species. Homo habilis is the first species in the genus Homo, and it was named habilis by the Leakeys because it was found together with a lot of stone tools. We now know stone tools are older. And it was found in Olduvai Gorge, which is in Tanzania. You can see the map here. Below, you see that it's a volcanic landscape, and Ngorongoro crater is a World Heritage Site. It's about the size of San Diego and has 22,000 large vertebrates in it. If you need to do one more thing in your life, is go to Ngorongoro crater. It's wonderful. It's extremely safe to visit. It's a national park, heavily guarded. You can see Laetoli, where the footprints are, is not too far from there. And the gorge, the Olduvai Gorge, you can see a picture of it, is over there. And the Ndutu Lakes are really famous for Nat Geo. That's most of the cheetah pictures you have seen come from there. Wonderful wildlife as well. This is what the gorge looks like on a rainy day. You can see the different layers that allow the geologists to time things quite precisely. In the corner up there is where they found the first fossil in East Africa. This is me a couple of years ago. It's impossible to set your foot somewhere without stepping on bones. And these are two million-year-old giraffe vertebrae that's just on the floor. It's been a huge treat to be able to take graduate students from UCSD there because it completely blows their mind. Now, Homo erectus, that came after Homo habilis, made it out of Africa. That's the first species of Homo that made it out of Africa. And this is a collection of 5 skulls that were found in Georgia in a place called Manisi. You can see how different these skulls are. There's one skull that has no more teeth, but regrown mandible. There were no evidence they were cooking yet, but somebody was feeding this old person because there's no way this old person was still chewing. So somebody must have been pounding their food. Very different skulls, and so that's considered the first movement out of Africa. But remember how sparse the fossil evidence is. It's a photo of me there with a beautiful 3D reconstruction of this skull that my colleagues, the Kennis brothers, who do these reconstructions, have in their workshop. Last year, brand new, a study of the teeth using a synchrotron, which is a very, very powerful source of energy to scan into the teeth at a detail that gives you data on daily incremental growth of these teeth. So you're reconstructing the developmental trajectory of each tooth of this 12-year-old dead thing that died almost 2 million years ago. And what it showed is that they had a slow life history. Unlike chimpanzees that grow their teeth quickly and then they're done, they had a delay more like humans. So this is part of the story, how you make not just a big brain, but a brain that is born and then continues growing for 1 year at a fetal rate while it is bathing in culture, in lullabies, in stories, in interactions. And that's how you become biologically enculturated, because your biology starts expecting the cultural input. And we now know very well from developmental psychology that if your brain does not get language exposure, if your brain does not get stimulation, then that's one of the worst things that can happen to your brain. So our biology has to become dependent on this cultural luxury that humans have evolved. And one thing, of course, that poverty and abuse do, or war, is that it deprives growing brains of that. Homo erectus made it all the way to Java. This is a reconstruction by the Kennis brothers of Homo erectus, and they decided to make a female Homo erectus for a change. And it's a composite of all the information we have on Homo erectus bones, and then they dress the skeleton. It's a composite skeleton. They dress it one muscle group at a time, wrap it in a skin. And she was going to hold this shell. It turns out this shell was found by my colleague Josie Jordans from Holland. It was found by Dubois, who found the fossil and then put in a drawer in a museum in Leiden. And she found it with all the other things Dubois found, and it was timed at almost 500,000 years old. This is the oldest human art that you see. These scratches are not random scratches. Somebody scratched this, I don't know what they were playing, tic-tac-toe, but this was made by Homo erectus 500,000 years ago. In Africa, meanwhile, Homo erectus becomes a runner, develops a waist, much taller, almost certainly finally has the capacity to have sustained running or persistence running that allows it to run down prey. It also becomes a top predator. Outside Africa, Homo erectus starts evolving into something quite different, cold adapted, that we know as Neanderthal. The ancestors of Neanderthals are found in Spain, in northern Spain, in Atapuerca, in Cima de los Huesos. You can see the railway track that was cut into this limestone for making limestone blocks to build buildings. It was a British company that put in the train, and then they found an elephant skull. And since then, people have found a lot of fossils. The oldest one is over 1 million years old, complete with some pretty disturbing evidence of systematic cannibalism of usually young individuals of the neighbors. That's another really fascinating story. Humans have, if you're really hungry, the neighbor starts looking tasty. In Africa, some evidence of the same thing. This is the Bodo skull, and the Bodo skull has been defleshed. You can see the cut marks made with obsidian. Somebody took out the eyeballs of this huge male after he died. And this is the reconstruction, and this is my friend Alphonse Adrien-Kennis holding a reconstructed head of Bodo skull. Eventually, outside Africa, Homo erectus evolved into Neanderthals that are named after a valley in Germany, Neandertal, which stands for valley. Neanderthals had quite distinct skeletons. They were very robust. They were cold adapted. We have a lot of information, multiple truckloads of bones. We even have bones of neonate Neanderthals here modeled in the pelvis of a female Neanderthal from another site to study whether they already had issues with birthing. This is a very famous reconstruction that the Kennis brothers in Holland did. Chris Stringer, who is a CARTA member and the director of the Natural History Museum in London, ordered these. It's a Homo sapiens, much taller, chewing on a little blade of grass, looking at a Neanderthal. It's very polite because you don't see they're completely naked and uncircumcised, and some British museum goers were really said, "What did you do to my daughter?" You know, some polyurethane frontal nudity in a museum. Now, of course, what archaeologists do is they read artifacts, and the earliest artifact you can read are stones. And the earliest stone tools used to be called Oldowan stone tools, named after Olduvai. They're relatively simple chunks of rocks you smash on a bigger rock, and once you have a couple of ridges, now you can break a big bone and get to the marrow in the bone. You can see down there the computer with all these stone tools. Each one has a little tag, so people are now scanning those and studying them. Now it turns out that the Acheulean hand axe, I brought you one. This is from Ramona. I made this in about 20 minutes. It's not a very good one, but it's close enough. It's this tear-shaped hand axe that you can use for all kinds of things. In fact, we don't quite know. Was it to get to a bee nest? Was it to adjust the attitude of a neighbor? Or was it just to show off? They're called Acheulean after a town in northern France, Saint-Acheul. And they're often referred to as the Swiss Army knife of human evolution, because for 1 million years, people were making these all the time. There are areas in Africa that are completely littered with these, mostly broken ones that, if you hit once wrong, it breaks the wrong way, and then you don't bother taking it anywhere. Well, that's a heat map, and that's a photograph of my colleague Jonas Beyene holding a 1.5 million year old hand axe in Ethiopia. He was telling me in that landscape, there's just hundreds of these things on the ground. It's hard to fathom what were they doing with that. But what were they were doing is they would find a rock, and in their mind's eye, they could see a shape inside the rock. And then they knew how to hit it the right sequence to get a symmetrical, or more or less symmetrical in my case, beautiful hand axe that had a pretty sharp edge for a long time. Of course, these flakes that fly off are what I'm handing around. It turns out that's the really precious thing, because they're small, you can break them and sharpen them again. So there's a lot of interest in what did this do to the human mind? Did this prepare our brains to read? Because we were reading rocks. We were trying to read shapes into round rocks, and eventually succeeded in making those on demand. It turns out, it's very complicated, the jargon. They're called Oldowan stone tools, Acheulean, Mousterian, Aurignac. You can see the French influence of early archaeology in France. But importantly, they became smaller, they became more symmetrical. My favorite is probably the Levallois, which is a Mousterian, where you prepare a core, and then it's like a Gillette box of blades, because you hit once, back, and what comes off is a pre-sharpened blade. And when that's dull, you hit again, back, and you've got the next one. And then things got really, really small, and people say, it's the really small things out of quartz and obsidian. You can put them on arrows and put some poison on it, and then you really need to read the tracks, because you shoot a big animal with poison, you have to wait an hour and then track it for 2, 3, 4 hours. But then you find a giraffe or a kudu, so it's really worth it. And then again, Berhan Asfa in Addis Ababa in the National Museum is showing us some microlithics or some microblades that date back hundreds of thousands of years. So that was part of the toolkit of modern Homo sapiens, was bows and arrows, projectile weapons that are not well documented in Neanderthals. They had spears that they could throw. There was no evidence for spear throwers or bows and arrows. So how are we to read these fossils? And this is the same information, the same fossils I showed you in the horizontal, read by 2 very famous paleontologists, Peter Schmid, who is in Zurich, and Tim White, who found Lucy and Ardipithecus. And there's one group of people who say, it's so bushy, nobody can say anything about who is whose ancestor. And Tim White is of another school. No, it's, yeah, there are some bifurcation, but it's kind of like a cactus. There are these robust Australopithecines, but there is a pretty straight line. And the truth is almost certainly going to be more complicated than both of these. So we don't know. We have to be honest about that. But we can celebrate the fact that we have more than a truckload full of fossils from many different places in Africa that have filled in the view. It is clear that we are bipedal apes, and that 3 things happened at completely different times upright walking, modern hands, and big brains. At some point, we also had sustained running and the use of fire, which we'll talk about a little bit more. It is telling that those 5 skulls I mentioned in Manisi differ as much from each other, or almost as much from each other, than 4 skulls found in Kenya at a site called Kubi 4 by Lake Turkana. That each is in a different species: Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and Australopithecus. So there are lumpers and splitters, as in every discipline. And the balance is listening to both of them, because they probably both are exaggerating. If you look at our bodies now, this early bipedality is well reflected in the feet that we have, in our knees, in our pelvis, in the fact that so many of us have back pain. But a lot of other changes, our wrists, our shoulders, our heads, have to do with using tools. The fact that your hand is like this has to do with your ancestors. This is culture, an idea. Oh, let's make a tool out of this rock. But you can't do it if you cannot hold the tools like that. If you don't have this coordination of holding it, it's highly one-sided. You hold your stone, you have another very hard stone, and you hit like crazy, but you know which angle you hit at and the strength at which you hit. And that's how you can generate something like that. So all of us pain, with low back pain, spine deformities, herniated vertebral disc, varicose veins, hernias, hemorrhoids, knee joints. It's been 6 million years, and we're still suffering. Fire was an absolute change the deal, a huge problem. Full disclosure, we have no idea how old it is. I think it's solidly 1 million years old. It could be twice as old. You can see me making a friction fire there on the side. That's the easiest way to make a fire. There's about 12 different ways you can make fires. But once you have fire, and this is one of the earliest evidence for fire, deep inside a cave, 1 million years old in South Africa, but it looks like it's a one-off. It doesn't look like it was repeated making of fire. So there could have been hundreds of thousands of years where there was fire harvested from volcanoes or lightning strikes, but when it went out, we were out of luck. In Europe, regular use of fire in Neanderthals only really shows up about 400,000 years ago. But there is fire in the Levant, in places like Gesher Benot Yaakov, that's 700,000 years old, with burned bones inside a cave. That's not a lightning strike. That's somebody barbecuing. So this is the landscape of where you find different fires across the world. And here the message is fire was a big game changer. We now have to eat cooked food. Humans are biologically dependent on the idea of treating food with heat. If you're a woman in a fertile age and you only eat raw food, you stop ovulating. How's that for natural selection for cooking? So we actually became dependent. It's a trap. It's such a good idea to cook food, and then you do it long enough, and then you can't go back. Farming is the same thing. You start farming, you have more babies. Now your population cannot go back to living off the land. So there are these ratchets of cultural evolution that land us a certain place. Who knows, maybe IVF will be one of those. Or C-sections. In fact, there's evidence with C-section rates as high as 90% in some populations, the the head-pelvis mismatch between infant and mother becomes so extreme that you could become dependent on doing C-sections. It's not totally crazy. So we've done that before with cooking and with other things. So here's what happened to the brain. You remember, bipedal, hands modernized, but for a very long time, our brain size, that of our ancestors, was not very different from that of a chimpanzee. And then woof, things started increasing. At the cost of having to give birth, where infants have to plates that move against each other, and we give birth socially. Most traditional human societies have a woman that goes along with the young mother that helps her give birth. It's become a social event. Great apes give birth solo and suddenly show up with an infant. And it's very non-traumatic, so no obstetrics needed for great apes. And possibly the thing we do most with this big head and this big brain is we read minds of others. Everything humans do is also performative, because we all know that we're being watched, we're being listened to, and most of us prefer being liked and appreciated. And that has a huge impact on what we do. If you don't believe me, look at how people behave online when they can leave anonymous comments, because then nobody is observing them, right? And long before social media, this was active. We might have been small groups of hunter-gatherers, but we know that these small groups, through language and personal names, had social networks that reached 200 kilometers away. And reputation was a huge thing. And among the most important reputation was that of being generous. And you can't really fake being generous. And so imagine what this must have done to us. I would argue that our brains and our minds and our psyches, just like with the cooking, we have become dependent on looking out for our reputation. And most of us know better than to behave in a way that will completely destroy our reputations. And that's probably a very, very good thing. I want to quickly show you that this is a wild chimpanzee in Mahale National Park in Tanzania. And he went into the tourist camp, and he totally doesn't get that it's him in the mirror. In zoos, they are used to reflective surfaces. Chimps usually get it pretty quickly. But he thinks, where's the guy behind, you know? And then it's more extreme. He says, I need to go and see where that guy is hiding. And I'm not trying to diss chimpanzees, right? I love chimpanzees. They don't need to be little people to be cool. But they almost certainly do not suffer from what many of us suffer. It's like, oh, what will they think of me? Did I commit a faux pas? Did I insult somebody?
Oh, like he thinks
they live in they're true Buddhists. They live in the moment. They're not worrying about that stuff. Let me quickly, I don't know when this popped up again. So what my colleagues and I have been trying to argue is that if you were to make a column with biology on one side and culture on the other, these are a couple of examples where, for example, making tools has shaped our anatomy of the shoulder, of the hand, and then cooking food and making fire has also shaped how we react to smoke, for example, whether we have TB or not. There's almost certainly a long association because of fire. But our teeth are ridiculous. We have almost no chewing power compared to a great ape. Our teeth are really, really small, but they have thick enamel. So the cooking has also changed the biology. And finally, probably most importantly, the saliva that is starting to get a bit thicker in my case now. When you speak, you need liquid saliva. Great ape saliva is much thicker than human saliva. And if you look at the brain, there are areas in our brains that have super highways of connections. Wernicke's and Broca's area, usually on the left side, have a connection in great apes, but in humans, it's massive. So there's an effect of being exposed to language on how your brain evolves. Now I'm going to end by talking about some of the most recent stuff that has to do with reading the code of life itself, reading DNA or reading the sequence of amino acids by proteomics. Sometimes there is no DNA left in a bone, but you can sequence, using mass spectrometry, you can sequence the collagen genes, some of the proteins of the collagen in the bone, and then translate that back into DNA and then see, oh, it's a Denisovan, it's not a modern human. So this has successfully been done. This is my colleague Svante Pääbo, who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine 2 years ago for founding the field of ancient DNA. And when you read DNA, you can compare the text. This is on the top, you have human sequences in green, and at the bottom you have great apes, Denisovans, and Neanderthal sequences. So this is one of these examples where there's a change only in humans. What does the change do? This change in this particular gene, never mind what it's called, lets neurons, precursor cells that give rise to baby neurons, are allowed to do so longer in humans than in Neanderthals and apes, which is one of the ways you get to a bigger brain. You have more sequential cell divisions. Now, what can you do with that? You wouldn't touch humans, but what you can do with that, you can use this is the model of non-human primate used in neuroscience, the marmoset from South America, 40 million years of divergence from humans. The normal monkey has a lissencephalic brain, which means it doesn't have any folds. It's smooth, like that of a mouse. The human brain is so folded because you make so many neurons, and that sheet runs out of space as it grows, so it starts folding. So if they put that one change into the developing brain of an embryo of one of these monkeys, the brain starts folding. And then they had to terminate it because they wouldn't let them have this monkey be born. So that's like the limit of where you can go with an experiment. But you can prove this one change in humans contributes to us having this big, expensive brain that allows us to do a lot of these things. The next thing you can do, and this is from my colleague Alison Mortry, who is in pediatrics and stem cell biology at UCSD, you can take cells and turn these cells into neurons in a dish. You do that from my skin cells or you skin cells. Once you have neurons, you can use CRISPR-Cas, which is an editing technology. You can put a one-letter change that's different between us, chimps, and Neanderthals on one side, and us, one change. Put that change into a human neuron, then let that neuron grow. And see how much it walks. It turns out the human neurons don't go as far. You put the Neanderthal sequence in there, and they walk more. They move more. We don't know what that means, but it's a different based on one letter in 3 billion letters. You can measure the density of synapses, the connections between neurons. That one letter change that we have, but Neanderthals don't, causes neurons in a dish to have more connections. And then you can let these neurons grow on a plate, and you measure how much they talk to each other. Because they make synapses and they start spontaneously firing. And you can see that if you put the Neanderthal version on, they fire much less than if you put the human variant in there. So these are some of the really cutting edges of where you don't kill an animal, you don't touch an animal. In the case of the marmosets, yes, you do kill a pre-born marmoset. But here you're using human cells without hurting anybody. And you can have a readout of a human-specific genetic change. This same change was now put in a mouse. And in the mouse, it actually massively alters the vocalization of these mice. I would never have noticed that because they had to record in ultrasound, because mice vocalize in ultrasound. But it could show a massive change with one letter that is human specific. Of course, that's super interesting because this might have to do with vocal communication. This is another example, another gene, TKTL1, same thing. That was put in a ferret. And in the ferret brain, it causes a massive change. So we're now homing in on genetic changes that you can prove are driving more neurons, longer development of the brain, more connections between the neurons, between not apes and humans, but between Neanderthals and humans. This is now done at single cell level. I will not bore you with that, but you can actually look in individual cell, how are the chromosomes opening up, allowing these genes to do their melody. And it turns out that you can even do so in old DNA you find from a Neanderthal. And you can look at how that DNA was modified with methylation, which regulates how genes are expressed. And if you do that, you put on a map where these genes are important. They're important in the limbs of modern humans, and they're really important in the voice box of modern humans. So this doesn't prove Neanderthals didn't have language, but it's very strong evidence that something happened to our larynx in the last 200,000 years that allowed us to do things differently than Neanderthals. So we're now in the realm of nanometers, right? We went from whole societies of great apes and humans to the tiniest little things, the arrangement of chemical groups on DNA. So the big picture is that we do have a lot of information. We have living great apes, and of course, they have evolved for 6 million years. They have some very interesting things, especially with regard to reproduction that have gone on. But brain-wise, no massive changes. Locomotion-wise, they have knuckle walking. But a lot of things have happened in human anatomy, in human physiology, and in human behavior. And of course, these are connected, and they probably have shaped each other. So if you just ask me, well, how old is bipedality? I think I can solidly convince you it's old. You know, it's 4 to 5 million years old. How old is primate? It could be old, but we don't know. Once the babies get very costly, you're better off with a pair bond because then father or adoptive father can help. Things like manual dexterity, we have pretty good information. With Australopithecus, it got better. Home bases, it's tough. That means you live in the same place. You come back and you share as a top predator, which Homo erectus became, you share the meat of very big animals. Chimpanzees eat monkeys and little antelopes. They never kill something 3 or 4 times their size. Humans specialized in that. That's how we caused the mass extinction wherever we showed up. Endurance running at some point, music, we don't know. Fire could be, 1 million years almost for sure, but probably deeper. Complex tools. There's now evidence for hand for stone axes with handles that are 400,000 years old from Colombo Falls in Zambia, and carved wood that people experimentally showed without a handle on that stone axe, you could not carve this wood to make a Lincoln log, which they found. Projectiles, we don't know who started throwing weapons, but modern humans had more of them than Neanderthals. Symbols, was reading footprints the first symbol, or was it a shell? We have no idea, but now we need symbols. You suffer if you don't have symbols. How old is language? Much more smart people that are much smarter than me regularly opine, oh, language is probably about 50,000 years old. I'm sorry, modern humans in Namibia and South Africa, the Khoisan people, branched from everybody else at least 150,000 years ago. They're fully modern. Their language, if anything, is more complex than ours because it has some nice clicks. So I don't think 50,000 cuts it. I think it's probably as old as our species. I would put out there, with that language, you don't have a modern human. So if modern humans are 300,000 years old, language was part of that, and so was fire, for sure. Theory of mind, that obsession about trying to figure out what others think of you, that can make us sick. But it's wonderful, too, because it makes us behave at our best, right? How old are shoes? Arrow poison, clothing? And just to remind you, what you read when you study history is the little green sliver there. So we have an issue in anthropogeny because we're trying to look at all the information that long predates. And I'll end by just trying to convince you that by studying how humans came about and what is special about us, not what makes us better, possibly what makes us much worse than a chimp. There's value to things like medicine, to, who is supposed to look after the young generation? What's the value of grandmothers and grandparents for their kids, and vice versa, by the way? What are we supposed to eat? ISIS doesn't have to do anything because America is now 75% overweight and obese. So they can just wait until we eat ourselves to death, right? Who should raise the kids? How important is the fact that we enjoy being nice to others? That's probably, I would argue, it's in our biology. We enjoy being nice to other people. Violence in humans is massively male biased. So, we should think of the mother goddess again and maybe concentrate on how females could diffuse male violence. We have technologies that changing the minds of our kids. We have to live in cities, more and more of us. We should move. And we should maybe think of not causing the sixth mass extinction, and possibly do something about what we cause to the climate. So if you're interested in that, we have an upcoming symposium in CARTA, which is called Mismatch, Human Origins and Modern Disease, not just your back and your knees. And I'll end with this very short little video.
Why do we humans face so many health challenges? The answer may lie in evolutionary mismatch, the disconnect between our ancient biology and the demands of modern life. Our body is adapted over millions of years to environments without agriculture, contraception, couches, and chronic stress. Now those same adaptations may be harming our health. Join CARTA on May 16th for Mismatch, Human Origins and Modern Disease, a free virtual symposium where experts explore how our past and present shape modern disease and what we can do about it. Register now at carta.anthropogeny.org.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.